Dr. Jeremy Landon stood at the bow of the research vessel Arctic Pioneer, his breath crystallizing in the brutal -40 degrees Celsius air. After months of preparation, years of research, and countless bureaucratic hurdles, his team had finally reached the coordinates that had haunted him since graduate school. Through the swirling snow, a dark shape emerged, the infamous Ghost Flight 2317. "There she is," he muttered, adjusting his thermal goggles. Behind him, Dr. Alice Neville, the team's medical officer, let out a small gasp. The passenger aircraft's fuselage jutted from the ice like the skeleton of a prehistoric beast, its metal skin preserved by decades of Arctic frost. The disappearance of Flight 2317 had become aviation legend. In 1978, the Boeing 737 had vanished during a routine flight from Lisbon to New York, carrying 114 passengers and crew. No distress signal, no debris field, no answers until now. "Start the preliminary scans," Landon called to his team. Dr. Joseph Julius, their aerospace expert, immediately began calibrating the ground-penetrating radar. Emily Jonas, their Arctic survival specialist and tracker, methodically photographed the wreckage from multiple angles. The remaining 4 team members prepared the ice-traversing equipment they would need for closer inspection. As the initial data streamed in, Landon reviewed the mission parameters in his mind. The Canadian government had granted them a narrow window, just 72 hours to document the site before a military recovery team would take over. Every minute counted. "Dr. Landon." The urgency in Emily's voice drew him to the monitoring station. She pointed to one of the high-resolution images on her screen. "Look at this," the photograph showed the plane's tail section. In the shadows beneath the stabilizer, a pale shape seemed to move, like a figure passing through mist. Landon frowned. Probably ice crystals catching the light. Run it through the enhancement software. But as Emily adjusted the image, more anomalies appeared. The snow around the wreckage showed signs of recent disturbance, tracks that couldn't have been made by their team. "We need to get down there," Landon decided. "Alice, Joseph, Emily, you're with me. The rest of you maintain position and keep monitoring the ice conditions. Report any changes immediately." The descent to the crash site was treacherous. The team moved in single file, connected by safety lines, testing each step. The wind had picked up, driving needle-sharp ice crystals into any exposed skin. As they drew closer, the true scale of the wreck became apparent. The plane had crashed nose first, then been preserved almost entirely intact by the surrounding ice. "The ice formation suggests this valley acted like a natural freezer," Joseph observed, running a gloved hand along the fuselage. "The temperature must have dropped rapidly after impact, preventing the usual deterioration." Emily circled the wreckage, her trained eyes scanning the ground. "These marks here," she pointed to several parallel grooves in the ice. "They're recent, maybe a few days old, and they're not from any Arctic wildlife I'm familiar with." Landon nodded grimly. "Let's get inside. Alice, you and Joseph take the rear section. Emily and I will check the cockpit, stay in radio contact." The interior of the aircraft was an eerily preserved time capsule. Frost-covered seats still held the remains of passengers, their clothes and personal effects frozen in place. A child's teddy bear peeked from beneath a seat. A magazine lay open to an article about the upcoming 1978 World Cup. As they moved forward, Alice's voice crackled over the radio. "Jeremy, we've got something odd back here. Several seats are empty, but according to the manifest, this flight was full. How many missing?" "5 passengers unaccounted for, and there's something else." The radio dissolved into static. At that moment, a low sound echoed through the fuselage, like metal groaning under strain. But there was something else in it, something almost like a voice. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung across her back. Before Landon could respond, a shadow passed across the cockpit window. The temperature, already well below freezing, seemed to drop further. Years of scientific training warred with primal instinct as Landon forced himself to move forward. The cockpit door was sealed by ice. It took both of them several minutes with ice picks to break through. Inside, the instruments were frozen in their final positions. The captain's logbook lay open on the console, its pages preserved by the cold. But it was the captain's last entry that made Landon's blood run cold. Engine failure. Storm worse. Something moving on the wing. God help us. A sudden crash from the rear of the plane made them both jump. "Alice! Joseph! Report!" Landon barked into his radio. Only static answered. Moving quickly but cautiously, they made their way back through the plane. The rear section was empty. A new hole had been torn in the fuselage, leading outside. Fresh tracks led away from the plane toward a dark opening in the ice wall that they hadn't noticed before. "It's a cave," Emily said, studying the tracks. "And these are definitely human footprints, mixed with something else. Something big." Landon keyed his radio. "Base, we've lost contact with Alice and Joseph. We're tracking them now. Send backup." "Negative," came the reply through bursts of static. "Storm moving in. You have 20 minutes to return before it hits." Landon looked at Emily. She nodded, checking her rifle. They followed the tracks into the cave. The temperature inside the cave was noticeably warmer, suggesting geothermal activity. Their headlamps revealed signs of human presence, scattered supplies, torn clothing, and finally, a leather-bound journal. Emily picked it up carefully. The first entry was dated January 15th, 1978, 3 days after the crash. The survivors had found the cave, used it for shelter. But as she read further, her expression grew increasingly troubled. 5 survived the initial crash, she said. They could see lights in the distance, tried to walk out, but the cold. She turned more pages. The last entry is from January 20th. They were running out of food and something was stalking them. A deep growl echoed through the cave. Their headlamp beams swung toward the sound, illuminating Alice and Joseph, pressed against the wall. Beyond them, 2 massive shapes moved in the darkness. "Nobody move," Emily whispered. "Polar bears, a mother and adolescent cub." The bears emerged into the light. The mother was enormous, even for her species. Her white fur yellowed with age. The cub, nearly full-grown, moved with a slight limp. Behind them, partially visible in the shadows, lay the answer to their mystery. 5 bodies, preserved by the cold, surrounded by scattered survival gear. "Back away slowly," Emily instructed. "They're not hunting. This is their den." Step by step, the team retreated. The bears watched but didn't pursue. Once outside, they ran for the plane, the storm closing in around them. They barely made it back to the ship before visibility dropped to 0. Hours later, safe in the ship's warm cabin, Landon reviewed their findings. The black box, recovered from the cockpit, revealed the full story. Flight 2317 had encountered a severe storm. Multiple engine failures forced them down. Some survived the crash, found shelter in the cave, but succumbed to cold and injury before help could arrive. The bears had claimed the cave later, drawn by the shelter it provided. Over the years, they had adapted to using the plane's wreckage as part of their territory. The tracks, the movements, the shadows they'd seen, all explained by the bears' natural behavior. "It's remarkable," Alice said, reviewing her medical notes. Those bears have survived in one of the harshest environments on Earth, using human structures as shelter. They've learned to adapt. Landon nodded, staring out the window at the now invisible wreck. The mystery of Flight 2317 had been solved, but not in any way he'd expected. Instead of a simple crash site, they'd found a testament to both human tragedy and nature's resilience. The next morning, as military helicopters approached to begin the recovery operation, Landon made one final note in his expedition log. In seeking to understand human disaster, we discovered nature's triumph. The Arctic holds many secrets, but perhaps none so profound as its capacity to transform tragedy into survival. The mother bear and her cub were relocated to a protected area, the wreck was eventually recovered, and the passengers' remains were returned to their families. But the story of Flight 2317 and its unlikely guardians became part of Arctic legend. A reminder that in the world's most hostile places, life finds a way to endure. Dr. Landon would lead many more expeditions throughout his career, but he never forgot the lesson learned in that frozen valley. Sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't the ones we set out to find, but the ones that find us.